How many Land Rovers are still on the road? By Land Rovers, I mean Land Rover the product from Series 1 all the way to Defender in 2016. How many are still on the road? You might be thinking of a number right now. Is that number 70% by any chance? Now, of course, if you're a Toyota owner, you would say 70% of Land Rovers are still on the road because 30% actually made it to their destination. But why is this number still ingrained in our consciousness? Well, in this video, I'm going to find out where that number actually came from. The date of this video is the 29th of January, 2026, which is exactly 10 years after our beloved Defender went out of production. They're not making any more, so surely that 70% number needs to be changing by now. Every winter, something flakes off my Defender or crumbles away. That's just the law of entropy. Even in 2023, Twisted Automotive on their Instagram claimed 76% of Land Rovers were still on the road. I did ask them what their source was in a comment. They didn't reply to me. So later on, I'm going to be telling you what I think the actual percentage of Land Rovers still on the road is in 2026. This started as a lockdown project in 2020, and it's got a little out of hand since then. So where did 70% come from? Well, TV might have had a bit to do with that. In 2003, Richard Hammond said this:
70% of all the Land Rovers built are still on the go today. 70%.
Also, around the same time as that clip, Vicky Butler-Henderson on Fifth Gear said this:
So they'll go virtually anywhere. In fact, they are so tough that it's reckoned 3/4 of the Defenders that have ever been built are still going strong.
So that was 2003. Where did it start before that? Well, Wikipedia gives us a clue. It says that Land Rover made that claim. So if we go to the 1992 brochure, LRD 588, on page 14, it says, and I quote, "In fact, of all the Land Rovers ever built, some 70% are still in operation." That's a bold claim, and surely bold claims need some kind of source or methodology to back it up. But hey, sells vehicles, right? This claim continued on into the 1993 brochure LRD 618, and then it disappeared in the 1994 brochure LRD 900. Presumably from that moment, it was just too hard to keep justifying. So Land Rover claimed their stat on the basis of still in operation. Richard Hammond said on the go, and Vicky Butler-Henderson said still going strong. Some fairly vague statements there. There's just enough ambiguity to be able to justify the claim you're making without having to dig in too much. What does it mean? Hasn't been scrapped? Could jump into it and turn the key and go? Has been parked up for 5 years, but we plan on getting it back on the road? Who knows what these definitions actually mean? Anyway, this statistic of 70% or thereabouts has pervaded the media in the years subsequent to 2003. In 2015, GQ claimed 75% are still running. Also in 2015, Land Rover itself made the 70% claim again. Whether they're including their entire range of models, it's not known, but it's ambiguous enough to sound good. When I went on the factory tour at the end of 2015, I'm sure many of you did as well, the tour guide said to us that 66% of UK-based Defenders were still on the road. It was the first time I'd heard that stat with a qualifying statement of meaning only UK Defenders. A few months later, when production finally ended in January 2016, the online media were still peddling their creative license when it came to the facts. Autocar said 70% are still on the road. BBC said 70% are still around. Commentary Live said 70% are still running. The Guardian said 66% are still on the road. The deputy editor of Land Rover Monthly magazine said 70% are still on the road. Silodrome claimed that Land Rover claimed that 70% are still in use, and they say it's probably true. I mean, why would a turkey vote for Christmas, right? It has to be true. In 2018, at the 70th anniversary of the first Land Rover, we have to pay credit to Euronews.green, who've had the most accurate reporting, who said, in 1992, the company claimed that 70% of all vehicles they had built were still in use. In 2020, Condé Nast Traveller said 70% are still on the road. And then there was that claim in 2023 when Twisted Automotive claimed 76%. Okay, so I think it's time we put this to bed. Actually, what percentage of Land Rovers are still on the road in 2026? So how do we define actually what is a Land Rover that we're talking about? It's a bit of a spectrum. So on the left here, we've got Solihull built, as the Defenders we know and love come out of Solihull, and they are the models that are driving around the UK for the most part, the vast majority. They include North American spec Defenders built in the UK. So yes, those are included. We've got Defender XD, the Wolf and the Pulse. Are they included? Well, within Defenders themselves, we've got the 90s, 110s and 130s. They do have different chassis, but most of the bodywork is the same, the parts are the same, so they're kind of considered to be Defenders within their own right. Defender XD, more similar than not. They do have different chassis and a lot of different parts, but we will include those. Now, there were Wolves built, 800 Pulsars built, and they were in the British Army. So do we include them? I've included them in the calculations if they've had a civilian MOT, of which about 500 have. That's a civilian MOT on their military registration number. And I've also included the ones that are now in private ownership, of which is 1,200. There's another 800 that I think have gone overseas. So there's about 6,000 of these left, of which I met Land Rover Classic a couple of years ago, and the guy said to me that the problem the British Army have got is that half of them off the road. So 3,000 are non-roadworthy. So that's why Land Rover have a contract with them now to bring back genuine parts for Wolves. I've included them in this scenario. There's probably another 2,500 there that may be off the road or maybe not, but I'm generally including the population if we've got data on them in the DVLA. I've also included imported Defenders, which are basically Solihull built, but just not registered at new in the UK. They went overseas and then they've been brought back into the UK. So they're Solihull built, and I do include them, of which I've got one of them over there. Then we move on to the complete knockdown kit, or the complete knockdown vehicles. These are ones where they had Solihull parts that were shipped overseas and they were assembled in places like Pakistan, Malaysia, Kenya, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Brazil, and Australia. In there, we've got things like the BMW M52 model, which is basically Land Rover. It's Land Rover South Africa made those with Solihull parts, and they put in a locally sourced BMW engine. And we've also got the Parenti, so the Australian Army version, which has a lot of Land Rover parts, but it was assembled in Australia. It's got an Isuzu engine. Moving further along, we've got Leyland, South Africa, the Blackheath plant in the 80s and 90s. Not part of Land Rover, I don't think, but had a lot of Solihull parts in it, but the chassis were made locally, and they were galvanised, in fact. So to the untrained eye, you would think they were Land Rovers, but they've got a different VIN prefix. So actually, there's only 6 in the UK, so I think I will include those. And then off the far end, we've got licensed Land Rover products. They kind of look like Land Rovers, but they're not made by Land Rover, and there's quite a few parts that are different. They kind of look similar. So we've got Santana and other licensed vehicles over there, which we're not going to include. So we've basically included anything that's got a connection to Land Rover, the company, and has parts made in Solihull that make up a majority of the vehicle. So using these rules and looking at the data sets of the DVLA and the DVSA, we have a total population size of 217,000 vehicles from 1982, when the first production prototypes came out for the 90s and 110s, up to 2016, of which that is 167,000 Defenders and 50,000 90s and 110s. And this is the number of those vehicles that have ever been registered in the UK. So that gives us the total population of vehicles that we're going to use to work out our percentage of how many of this amount are still on the road in the UK. So on the other side of the equation, how do we define their usage, or how many are still left, however we want to term it? Now, existence of Defenders, that's really hard. If they're still in a field and in theory they could turn a key and start again, that's really hard to identify. My Defender here was off the road for 7 years. It wasn't scrapped. It was still going to go back on the road. It just wasn't on the road for 7 years. So really, whether it's on the road or off the road kind of depends on the intention of the owner. Existence is really hard to define. What I've got with the DVLA and DVSA data sets is I've tried to reverse engineer what I think would be the intention of the user in defining whether a vehicle is on the road. So if it's taxed and it's got a valid MOT, then it's on the road. If it's sawned, it's not on the road. If it's exported, it's not on the road. Doesn't mean that it's not still in existence. These could be scrapped. These have gone overseas, which basically means we don't have the data anymore. This should mean it's not scrapped. If it's failed a day and it's less than 14 days, that means it's still within the retest period. So we don't know that it's not off the road, because it really depends. If it's gone a failed MOT in more than 14 days, then it's probably considered to be off the road. Considering I'm tracking this data on a weekly basis, I would consider at that moment the vehicle to be off the road. If it's had no MOT, that means there's no MOT record, digital record of it. It means it hasn't had an MOT since about 2005. So that also means it's off the road. And that's the best I could come up with, really, because we've got the data set there. Otherwise, we're going to have to go around and do a census of the entire population, every field, every bit of land in the world, to try and find Land Rovers hidden away in every square metre and find if they still exist. I went to say, probably about 10 years ago, I went to stay on a farm in Wales, and all of the yards were just full of old vehicles, and there were loads of Land Rovers in there. Those Land Rovers still existed, but they hadn't been on the road since there was an MOT, digital MOT record history. So as far as the data showed, they didn't exist, or they were off the road. But they were actually off the road because, they were just in a farmyard. But it doesn't mean they couldn't come back. And that's really the tricky bit. So off the road generally means We don't know if they still exist. We just know that they're not being driven. So that's what we're getting towards, is how many are still being used on a regular basis, or at least for the owner to intend for them to be used on a regular basis. So looking at how we define defenders and how we define whether they're on the road or not, let's go and take a look at my website and see what the percentage is that's come out of these calculations. So for defenders 1990 to 2016, using these calculations, the figure comes out as 49 to 50% still on the road. For 90s and 110s from 1982-83 up to 1989, the figure is 16 to 18%. So in real terms, there's about 9,000 fewer defenders on the road in the UK since 4 years ago, which is about a 5% drop. And for 90s and 110s, it's dropped about 3%. So 5% and 3% of the overall populations of those vehicles have dropped in the last 4 years. So that kind of gives me confidence in Land Rover's statement on the factory tour that 66% of UK registered Defenders were still on the road at the end of 2015, because we've dropped 5% over 4 years. You can kind of work that backwards and see how that would probably be quite a reliable figure to use. However, what we saw in the media was it got distorted quite a lot. They were tending to say all Land Rovers, 70% of all Land Rovers were still on the road, still going strong, still in operation, whatever you want to say. That gives it a global spin. However, the 66% of UK vehicles at the time, I think, was quite a reliable statement. If we combine both the total number of Defenders and 90s and 110s, that gives us a percentage on the road for those vehicles of 42 to 43%, I estimate. So like with all good methodologies, let's discuss the results and some of the caveats here. So when we talk about exported vehicles, they could still be on the road in other countries, but I don't have the data set on that. You know, we know tons of Defenders go to the US and they're probably on the road or used, but there's no data to support that. So I can only assume that from the UK perspective, exports, they are not on the road anymore. Some vehicles do get re-imported, but most of them are gone for good. Also, the sum of the off-the-road vehicles in the data set will actually be exported. So my first Defender went to the US in 2021. And if I look up the registration number on DVLA, it doesn't say that it's exported. The research I've done online, you can find a whole load of shipping documents and that kind of stuff. And if you go and look up their registration numbers, they don't say they're exported either. So I think there's a lot of companies playing quite fast and loose with the UK paperwork, shall we say. The other thing is the Wolves. I say only about 500 of the 6,000 Wolves less have had an MOT, a civilian MOT, and they won't be included because they don't tend to have it sporadically. So that could shift the numbers a bit, because I'm counting them in the total, but I'm not counting them in the on the road stats. But they're only 3.5% of the total number of Defenders ever built. So it shouldn't skew the stats that much, really. We do have, in the 90s and 110s, the 40-year-old MOT exemption is starting to creep in at the lower end in 83, 84, 85. So there might be some of those vehicles that are on the road but don't have an MOT. That could be quite possible, but at the moment that number of vehicles is relatively small. So I've made my very specific claim, which I think is quite accurate, that 42 to 43% of 90s, 110s and Defenders that have been registered in the UK are still on the road. That I can be very specific about, and I think that's fairly accurate based on the methodology that I've applied. Can we try and extrapolate that to all Land Rovers? So all from the Land Rover Series 1 up to the Defenders in 2016. So 90s, 110s and Defenders, there's about 660,000 of them, maybe a bit more, that were built. We're going to exclude CKD Defenders here, just for simplicity. If we then say that there were 2 million Series and 90-110 Defender vehicles made, and assuming that there are about 5% of series vehicles still on the road in the UK, the overall percentage still on the road of the 2 million would be somewhere in the region of 13 to 15%, using that assumption. If there's 10% still on the road in the UK, this would go up a little bit, but not by much, because it's dwarfed by the fact that we've lost 60% of these, and actually up here we've got 50 on the Defenders and we've got about 16% on the 90s and 110s. So they drop off quite rapidly as you go back between the generations. So I'd expect Series 3, Series 2, Series 1 to drop off quite rapidly. So there'll be less of them around than the later models. So yeah, what do you think of that? So I definitely think that's a lot more realistic than 70% of Land Rovers still on the road. A lot more Land Rovers may still exist at some part, in some corner in a farmer's field, for example, but whether they're on the road or not, I think we can quite accurately calculate that. Can we extrapolate this to the entire world? Well, 70% of 90s, 110s and Defenders were sold into Europe. and let's imagine they have a similar attrition rate, wealthy countries, tarmac roads. Imagine they have a similar attrition rate to the UK. 70% actually it'd probably be about the same percentage. If we're going to cover 70% and have the same assumptions, it would probably be about 40% or so over the entire world for this population. Series Land Rovers may even be the same. Anecdotally, when I travel to Africa and Asia, I really struggle to find Land Rovers. There really aren't that many around. I cannot see that many at all. 20 years ago, I saw a lot more when I was in Africa, but these days, really struggling to see them. So there we go. I think it's not 70% anymore. I think it's time to update our statistics. If you want to see the latest figure for 90s 110s and Defenders, then check out my website with a link in the description. You can see how the attrition rate goes over time. It's just going to sit there tracking how many vehicles there are still on the road in the UK. If you've got any comments or questions, then that's what the comment section's for. We can have a discussion about these numbers down below. Anyway, thanks for watching. Bye for now. I just want to say a word about why I've been working on this for 5 years. So we've got the DVLA database. They have things like Q plates. So the original VIN doesn't exist, so I can't match it up to factory records. That can be a bit tricky sometimes. There's also tons of typos in the DVLA database. So when you register a vehicle from the military and register it as a private vehicle, or you import it, which is what I did with my other one, you write down the VIN by hand and then someone types it in. And you have to read that VIN off the vehicle. So there's so many typos in here. People read an L as a 1, a U as a V, an S as a 5, and vice versa. They get the numbers switched around. So there's thousands of typos in the DVLA database that I've had to fix. With the DVSA, that's MOT records based on your vehicle registration mark, your number plate. And if you don't have an MOT for, let's say, 5 years, your number plate drops off. And then when you go and have an MOT again, they would type the vehicle in, it becomes basically a duplicate record. There are thousands and thousands of duplicate records, basically where you've got two vehicles with the same registration mark. And you've either got to work out whether it is the same vehicle, it just has two separate records, or whether it's actually another vehicle, because it's very common for people to buy a brand new vehicle, put a private plate on it, and then they crash that vehicle, insurance pays out, they buy another vehicle, transfer the registration number, but that registration number still exists in the MOT history on the original vehicle. That's not updated because it's scrapped. So you've got to work out whether the two records here relate to two different vehicles at different times, or whether it's one vehicle but duplicate MOT records, and there are thousands and thousands of those. You've also got false positives to deal with because you've got tons of discoveries recorded as defenders in the data. So if you imagine this data is entered, or the DVLA data is entered, the model is entered by dealerships when the vehicle's registered brand new. So if you imagine if you choose a model in a drop-down list, Defender is above Disco alphabetically, you could easily misselect and choose Defender by mistake. So there's hundreds of those. Then you've got the false negatives, which are Defenders, they're actually recorded as Discos. So that's where I've had to basically use the VIN data to cross-reference this whole thing. So it's not just a case of downloading these, using the APIs and merging them together. There's loads of typos, there's loads of Q plates, there's loads of duplicates, which sometimes aren't duplicates, there's loads of incorrect discoveries. So basically I've had to cross-reference it from VIN numbers across to these databases, and then registration numbers back to the VINs. And that has taken me so far about 5 years, and I've had to go through probably about 5,000 or 6,000 records manually to get to this point. And there's still a few hundred left to go. I'm always improving it. And there's still always vehicles, there's dozens of vehicles imported into the UK every year, so I keep having to update the numbers and checking the VINs on those as well. So that's a bit of backstory, just to see why this thing is a bit challenging. But I believe my database is the most accurate database of Land Rovers because I've been fixing so many of these typos. I can cross-reference, and particularly as well, you've got Northern Ireland vehicles. You've got a Northern Ireland data set, which has only recently been included in the DVSA data set. So you've got people, the process to register vehicles in Northern Ireland would actually be a re-registration process. So you've got even vehicles moving between Britain and Northern Ireland are having duplicates and also typos in their VINs. So it's incredible, really. The other interesting thing about DVLA dataset, I have found at least a dozen cases where there is the same VIN number on multiple vehicles. So you've got one VIN number and two discrete MOT histories, completely separate vehicles, completely different. There's nothing to say that they would be the same. But as far as the DVLA is concerned, they've got the same VIN number. The DVLA doesn't check whether a VIN number is correct. But in my database I've been able to fix a lot of those. And that reduces the number of duplicates. So that's why I think my number of 167,000 Defenders is the most accurate number that there is.